There's nothing to fear except God, whatever that means to you.
For me, God is a disease.
Welcome to episode 45 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors of divorce, with two films that take as their basis the real-life divorces of their respective directors, and use the decay of the family unit to explore themes of emotional violence, body horror, and gender politics, albeit in very different ways. First up, we have the controversial and extremely intense Possession from 1981. This stars an award-winning Isabelle Adjani and Sam Neill, and was the fourth feature from Polish director Andrzej Żuławski. Then we follow this with our third film in the series from director Alex de la Iglesia, La Bruja de Zugarramurdi, or The Witches of Zugarramurdi, which was given the absolutely dreadful English language title of Witching and Bitching. This stars regular de la Iglesia collaborators Hugo Silva, Maria Casas and Carmen Maura, and was released in 2013. Along the way, we'll be discussing the early careers of Andrzej Żuławski and Isabelle Adjani, the actual history of the Witches of Zugarramurdi, and much, much more. But before we do any of that though, as always, I'd like to begin by mentioning the key sources that I've used for this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing Possession, I have heavily referenced the book Possession by Alison Taylor, published as part of the Devil's Advocate series from Liverpool University Press. And I've also referred to directors' commentaries, interviews and special features on the 4K special edition from Second Sight Films. I've also referred to interviews with Andrzej Żuławski, Isabelle Adjani and Sam Neill. That can be found on the websites faroutmagazine.co.uk, filmcomment.com, metrograph.com, arabbitsfoot.com, indiewire.com, scoop.co.nz, and theguardian.com. And when discussing Witching and Bitching, I have referenced interviews with Alex de la Iglesia on the websites glamour.es, cinemascomics.com, hollywoodreporter.com, photogramas.es, lpay.com, cinemaeveryeye.it, and cinemaeuropa.org. And as always, I have also referred to the Wikipedia and IMDb entries for both movies, the cast, the directors, and the crew. Possession is the fourth feature from Polish director Andrzej Żuławski, and is a film that is fairly difficult to categorise. Part body horror, part domestic drama, part monster movie, and all art house, it is perhaps less of a film and more of a scream from the depths of the psyche, reflecting the director's own personal traumas experienced during a messy divorce. Incredibly complex and dealing with themes that include the agony of heartbreak, psychological warfare, religion and anti-communist sentiment, Żuławski called Possession one of the most personal stories that he ever told. He also described it as an anti-Marxian narrative set against a background of Marxism, and, somewhat more memorably, a story about a woman who fucks with an octopus. An incredibly intense experience, which is putting it mildly, the story of its production and distribution seems equally as fraught as the drama that unravels on screen. Both Isabelle Adjani and Sam Neill were deeply traumatized by the experience, and have subsequently been critical of the methods employed by the director on set. Sam Neill has described the behaviour as bullying, and Isabelle Adjani accused him of psychological manipulation, even going so far as to describe the film as psychological pornography. At its premiere at the Cannes Film Festival in 1981, it caused a sensation, and along with the film quartet won Isabelle Adjani the Best Actress Award, making her the only recipient in history to win for 2 films at the same festival. It also drew praise and condemnation in equal measure, with some hailing Żuławski as a genius, and others describing his work as dark, deeply disturbing, and suggesting it had offended the entire festival. And the controversies would continue long after the festival was over. In September 1984, the film was caught up in the UK video nasties debacle and was effectively put on trial after copies were seized under the Obscene Publications Act. Meanwhile, in the States, it was butchered by distributors, who tried to cut its 2-hour runtime to 88 minutes and repackaged it as a monster movie, making an already challenging film fairly incomprehensible in the process. As a result, for many years, it became quite the challenge to see Possession in its original and intended form, though it soon gained a reputation among the initiated, and word of mouth began to spread. Over time, the film became more widely available, thanks to Blu-ray boutique releases, which introduced new audiences to the intensity of its camera work and performances, as well as its themes of marital conflict, religion, and political division. Since then, it has gone on to influence films, including the Suspiria remake from 2018 and the 2024 reboot of the Omen franchise, as well as directors including Gaspar Noé and Julia Ducournau, who insisted that her actors watch the film as preparation for her 2016 movie, Raw. More recently, its rediscovery by the YouTube and TikTok generation has led to a resurgence in popularity, or should that be notoriety, and so it's not surprising that a Hollywood remake is currently in pre-production. At the time of recording, it has Parker Finn, the creator of the Smile franchise, on board to direct. I don't really like to dismiss remakes completely out of hand because, as we know, over the years, there have been those that surpassed expectations. And given the intensity of performance that Finn drew from Naomi Scott in the second Smile movie, you can see why he would be a logical choice to direct. But I have to say that I have more than a few misgivings about the exercise, mostly around the idea of remaking a movie that the director called the most personal story that he ever told. Andrzej Żuławski was born in Lviv, now part of Ukraine, in 1940, 1 year after Poland was annexed by the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1939. Saying that he didn't choose cinema, but that it chose him, at the age of 19 he moved to Paris, where he studied filmmaking at the prestigious Institute for Advanced Film Studies, which he combined with a study of philosophy at the Sorbonne. In 1962, he completed his studies and returned to Poland, where he apprenticed under Andrzej Wajda, one of the country's leading film directors, and for whom he worked as a second unit director. And then in 1971, he released his own debut feature, an avant-garde psychological drama called The Third Part of the Night. This film is set in Nazi-occupied Poland, and opens with a reading from the Book of Revelation, setting the apocalyptic tone for the story that is to follow. After witnessing the murder of his family at the hands of the Nazis, protagonist Mikhail attempts to join the resistance, but is drawn away from this path by violence, scientific experimentation, and an appearance by supposed doppelgangers, a narrative conceit that we would see the director use once again in Possession. Foreshadowing what was to come, on its release, The Third Part of the Night was described as a half-real and half-dreamed adventure, while other reviews highlighted that even in his directorial debut, he was already experimenting with narrative and style. And importantly for our story, as well as drawing critical acclaim and winning him the Andrzej Monk Award for Best Feature Debut, the film also introduced him to actress Małgorzata Braunek. The two would go on to marry and have a child, and it was the breakdown of this relationship that would serve as the inspiration for Possession a decade later. His second film was called The Devil, and would again deal with the invasion of Poland, only this time by the Prussian army in 1793. Following a political prisoner who returns home to find his former life devastated, this was once again both highly experimental and highly political, dealing with themes of betrayal, societal collapse, and the corruption of power. As a result, in 1972, it was banned by the communist authorities, who felt it to be a not-so-thinly veiled critique of the communist regime. As a result, Żuławski moved to France, where he made his third film, a romantic drama called That Most Important Thing, Love. Starring French-German actress Romy Schneider and Italian actor Fabio Testi, this is a study of the nature of acting and also the film industry. It was also enormously successful, winning Schneider the inaugural César Award for Best Actress in 1976. The success of this film prompted Polish authorities to encourage a return to Poland, where he would begin his next feature, a science fiction film called On the Silver Globe. Based on a novel written in 1900 by his granduncle Jerzy, this film was to tell the story of a group of scientists attempting to build a new society on the moon, with the director using the trappings of science fiction to deliver further critique of communist rule. According to writer Alison Taylor, the film was, quote, a vast and convoluted rumination on religion, existentialism, and humanity, complete with bloody battles against a species of monstrous birds, cave orgies, and grotesque seaside crucifixion. End quote. But although the screenplay had initially been approved by the Ministry of Culture, 2/3 of the way through filming, the production was visited by a new minister, a man described by Żuławski as, quote, a rather clever guy, totally subservient to the regime, and a nasty piece of work. End quote. After watching a screening of the footage, the minister declared that the film was against the principles of political, cultural, and social life, and not only shut the production down, but also demanded that all sets, costumes, and copies of the film be destroyed. Fortunately, some of the work was secretly preserved by members of the crew, and it would eventually be completed after a fashion in 1988, with the missing scenes described by Żuławski in footage recorded as he wandered through contemporary Warsaw. As if this wasn't enough, the ministry also removed Żuławski's work permits, ensuring that not only could he not continue with filmmaking, but he could barely work at all, leaving him unable to even find work as a taxi driver. Meanwhile, his marriage was collapsing, triggered by long absences, intense arguments, infidelity, and battles over their son. These two scenarios, the breakdown of his marriage and the collapse of his career at the hands of communist authorities, would go on to inspire the screenplay for Possession, a creative process that he has described as rising from desperation, saying, quote, that's when I imagined this crazy story while walking down Warsaw's grey streets. It was so miserable, gloomy, and resentful at that time, and I invented the story of an ordinary woman who lived there and saved her soul. She cultivated, in a small flat in a poor part of Warsaw, something unimaginable, beyond all systems, and beyond the grey streets and red flags. End quote. The film, then, is very much a magnification of his private life, and many of the incidents in the first half of the movie were drawn entirely from his own lived experience, including the dialogue, which recreated real arguments, and Mark's discovery of his small son Bob, left at home alone and covered in jam. And now we are getting into the spoilers section of the episode, so if you haven't seen the film, from here on in, all usual warnings apply. Possession follows Mark, played by Sam Neill, a government agent who returns home to West Berlin following a mission in the Eastern Bloc. On his arrival, he immediately enters into an argument with his wife Anna, played by Isabelle Adjani, who wants to end their marriage even though she is unable to clearly express the reasons why. Mark leaves Anna in charge of their apartment and their young son, Bob, and goes on an extended drinking spree, returning home some days later to find Bob abandoned and alone in the apartment, covered in jam and clearly neglected. Establishing that Anna is having an affair with a man called Heinrich, when she eventually returns to the apartment, Mark pressures her into ending the relationship, at which point she leaves in the middle of the night, allegedly to stay with a friend. The next day, Mark meets Bob's kindergarten teacher, a woman called Helen, who is almost identical to Anna, bar her hair colour and piercing green eyes. Importantly, though, Mark is the only person who comments on the resemblance between the two, and it is entirely possible that the similarity exists solely in his imagination. Through this perspective, then, Helen becomes Mark's idealized version of Anna, the woman he once fell in love with all of the troubling aspects of her character cut out. Helen, a vision in white, seems calm, caring, and measured, a sharp contrast to the hysteria of Anna, who wears dark clothing throughout the film. And this contrast also extends to their respective professions. While the two of them may both be teachers, Helen is clearly depicted as a nurturing figure, while Anna is cruel and sadistic, dishing out a particularly venomous life lesson to a young dancer, which is revealed through a home movie that is played later in the film. And while Anna uses the kitchen as a battleground, inflicting harm on herself with an electric carving knife, Helen uses her kitchen as a place of nurture, and also seems far more interested in Bob when compared with Anna's neglect. This is not to suggest, though, that Helen is some form of subservient fantasy figure. She certainly has thoughts and opinions, it's just that she expresses them in ways that are less emotional than her double. But there is also something very disturbing about her, something that feels unnatural. And it's quite clear that Bob feels this too, having nightmares in the classroom and again at home when Helen spends the night. So, while she may well represent Mark's idealized version of Anna, it is also quite clear that she probably signifies something else as well. And this is something that springs from the film's setting of a divided Berlin. Although Żuławski's original treatment had been set in Warsaw, following the cancellation of On the Silver Globe and his effective blacklisting, it soon became apparent that, were the film to be made at all, it could not be made in Poland. But fortunately, a contact at Paramount Studios offered a lifeline and invited Żuławski to the States under the pretense of work on a film. Applying to the communist authorities for a passport, Żuławski was told that he had 24 hours to leave Poland quietly, and was also warned, without any subtlety, that the government would be watching to see what he had to say once he was in the West. On arriving in the States, he was set up in a New York hotel that was to be paid for by a producer called Pierre Caro, and once there he began developing the treatment for possession, which by this time ran to 20 pages. But as it was his first film in English, he needed some help translating his vision onto the page. His first choice, screenwriter Danielle Thompson, declined due to a conflict of styles, but she did recommend an American novelist and film critic called Frederick Tutton. Tutton was then sent Żuławski's original treatment and said that immediately on reading it, he knew that the film would be something extraordinary. Hitting it off immediately on their first meeting, Tutton and Żuławski began working on the screenplay, first in New York and then later in Paris. By this stage, it was decided that instead of Warsaw, the film would be set in divided Berlin, firstly due to its proximity to Poland, and secondly because the division of the city symbolizes many of the film's central themes. From the very opening shot, the wall plays a dominant role, almost becoming an additional character. On an immediate level, the division of the city reflects the division in the couple's relationship, just as their fractured dynamic mirrors the split between the communist East and the supposed freedom of the West. But the wall also acts as a constant reminder of the communist forces that derailed Żuławski's earlier film, and it's therefore a representation of evil, reinforced by footage of soldiers watching the actual filming with interest, and not a little hostility, from their vantage point on the eastern side. It also functions as a symbol for the entire film, described by the director as, quote, an entrenched psychology of people surrounded by evil, and finally evil worms up in their universe, end quote. And this idea of the nature of evil, and whether it can be easily identified, is a concept that lies at the heart of the movie, emphasized most notably in dialogue from Helen, who tells Mark that in the East, evil is far more easy to recognize because you are surrounded by it every day. But although the writing relationship was a positive one, the pre-production process would not be without its challenges, most notably when the supposed producer Pierre Caro disappeared one day after declaring bankruptcy, leaving Żuławski high and dry with an unpaid hotel bill in his name. The bill would be picked up by co-writer Tutton, and the project itself was eventually taken on by a new producer, a woman called Marie-Laure Ray, whose support enabled the production to continue and, importantly, for the casting process to begin. A character-driven horror that opens in the middle of a domestic dispute, Possession is a film that relies heavily on the central performances. The first 45 minutes are less about storytelling and more of an outburst of raw and vicious emotion. And while this is delivered with exceptional performances from leads Sam Neill and Isabelle Adjani, both of them would not emerge from the filming process unscathed. Sam Neill would later describe Possession as the most extreme film that he ever made, an experience that he said pushed him to the very limit and left his sanity barely intact. Meanwhile, Adjani, who reportedly attempted suicide on seeing the completed movie, has gone on to describe the film as psychological pornography, stating that making it felt as though someone was peeling off her skin and that mentally she went to, quote, very scary places where I shouldn't have gone, end quote. Isabelle Adjani, who is, in my opinion, one of the finest actors that France has produced, was born in 1955 to an Algerian Muslim father and a German Catholic mother. She grew up bilingual, fluent in both German and French, and began acting in amateur theatre after winning a school recitation contest at the age of 12. A prodigious talent, she first gained acclaim as a theatrical actress, joining the prestigious Comédie Française theatre at the age of just 16. She made her feature film debut in 1970 in a film called Le Petit Bounin, and further small film roles followed, including the 1974 film The Slap, in which her performance caught the attention of director François Truffaut. 5 years earlier, he had completed writing the screenplay for his film The Story of Adele H, but had held off from making it until he could find an actress he felt perfect for the lead. And on seeing Adjani, he knew that he had found her. The Story of Adele H is based on the real-life story of Adele Hugo, the daughter of writer Victor Hugo, and whose obsessive and unrequited love for a soldier leads to insanity and the eventual loss of everything. Despite being considered a commercial disappointment in France, Adjani's performance was unanimously praised by the critics and would earn her an Oscar nomination for Best Actress in a Leading Role. Aged just 19, she was at the time the youngest nominee in that category, and that was a record she would retain until 2003, when 13-year-old Keisha Castle-Hughes was nominated for the film Whale Rider. Adjani would also be nominated for, and win, many other awards for her performance, including a David Di Donatello Award for Best Foreign Actress and the Best Actress category at the New York Film Critics Circle Awards. She followed this with the female lead in Roman Polanski's psychological horror The Tenant, and 2 more roles in France, in 1976 opposite Gérard Depardieu in Barocco, and then as the female lead in Violette and François, which was released in 1977. And of course, following her Oscar nomination, there was also significant interest from Hollywood. Although she turned many roles down, she made her American film debut in 1978 with The Driver, co-starring Ryan O'Neal and directed by Walter Hill. Although it performed very well in Europe, particularly in France, the film was not a success on its release in the States, though it has undergone a critical re-evaluation and has been cited as an influence by Edgar Wright, Quentin Tarantino and Nicholas Winding Refn, particularly on the latter's film Drive, which was released in 2011. Returning to Europe, her next role was as Lucy in Werner Herzog's remake of the classic silent movie Nosferatu, which was titled Nosferatu the Vampire. This film was well received critically and commercially at the time, and is now seen as a classic, though I have to admit, and this is no doubt blasphemy to some, I do find it a little bit hard going at times. Although Adjani would continue making movies, including a performance as Emily Bronte in 1979's The Bronte Sisters, by now she had begun to develop a reputation for difficult on-set behaviour, and this, combined with a perceived failure to deliver on the promise of her early success, meant that film roles were starting to become a little bit thin on the ground. Even then, she initially passed on possession when it was first offered to her, a decision that, according to Żuławski, was prompted by her reluctance to play the role of a mother, despite by this time having a child herself. And this is something that probably says as much about the film industry of the time as it does about Adjani's character, the implication being, of course, that once you start playing mothers, producers and casting directors begin to see you as little else. With Adjani temporarily out of the picture, thoughts then turned to the Australian actress Judy Davis, who at the time was starring in a film called My Brilliant Career, alongside the New Zealand actor Sam Neill. Żuławski and his producer were impressed by both, but while Neill accepted the role of Mark, Judy Davis expressed reluctance to take on the role of Anna. And then, while she was still debating, suddenly Adjani appeared to have a change of heart. This change of mind appears to have been prompted by a man called Bruno Nuccian, who had been hired by Żuławski as the cinematographer for Possession, and who also just happened to be Isabelle Adjani's then husband. Whether Żuławski knew this or not at the time of hiring him remains unclear. According to the director, he didn't, and just happened to one day be complaining about the fact that Adjani had turned him down, which prompted Nuccian to intervene. But producer Marie-Loy Ray tells a slightly different story, saying that Nuccian's identity was well known and that on reading the screenplay, Nuccian told her he thought the role would be perfect for Isabelle, and that was what prompted him to intervene. In any case, Adjani accepted the role, and this was a decision that would lead to multiple award nominations and wins, whilst also nearly destroying her altogether. To say that she commits to the role of Anna would be an understatement, at times directing the intensity of her performance direct to the camera and straight into the soul of the viewer. She later described the project as being something of great violence, calling it a role that she could only have done in her 20s, when she was young enough not to, quote, realise how dangerous it could have been, end quote. Ever since the film's release, questions have been raised regarding Żuławski's methods for drawing such intensity from his actors. Even at the Cannes premiere, Adjani accused him of emotional manipulation and of pressing on her weak points until they cracked. And although he largely danced around her complaints in later interviews, this is something that Żuławski also appeared to confirm himself in another interview also given at the Cannes premiere, saying, quote, "It was a very hard shoot for her, very difficult for many reasons. At the end of the second day, there was a huge psychodrama between us because she was a frozen character, afraid to show herself, afraid of herself, and not knowing if she had the right to draw from her life. I don't pretend to have the therapeutic keys at all, but I knew what I needed, and so I cruelly played somewhere. I pressed where I had to press. That's all. Regardless of what it might do to her, as good or bad. It's part of the job, which is a very cruel job." End quote. Coming from what he calls a poor school of filmmaking without the luxury of multiple takes, Żuławski has said that he works extensively with actors during rehearsals, though he has always been very guarded about his techniques. He has compared acting to shamanism and has studied trance phenomena, and there has been much speculation that he may have, on occasion, induced trance states in his performers. This claim is seemingly supported by an interview he gave in 1997, in which he spoke about doing this with the help of his assistant, though it has to be clarified that Possession and Isabelle Adjani are not specifically mentioned. Nevertheless, it would go some way towards explaining the sheer insanity of Adjani's performance, most notably in the film's most famous sequence. In this, Anna seemingly miscarries the notion of faith in the subway, something that Żuławski has said represents the idea of words and ideas being given form. According to the director, he gave Adjani just one direction, which was to, quote-unquote, fuck the air, and, as we can see on the screen, the results were extraordinary. Filmed at 3 a.m. in a closed-off pedestrian tunnel, this seemingly unending explosion of Anna's psyche has been described by writer Kier-La Janisse as the scene that most often divides viewers, because of its unapologetic emotional excessiveness. She has also noted that it lasts for so long that it, quote, starts off shocking, switches to ridiculous, and then lands at truly frightening, end quote. Shot in 2 takes, the second as a precaution because someone's feet had strayed into shot, co-star Sam Neill said that it was on viewing the footage later that he realised the film they were making was something special, and it's a moment that is now quite rightly famous. It's also a moment that many recent performances have attempted to homage, with rather mixed results. The best of these include Lily Rose Depp in 2024's Nosferatu and Nell Tiger-Free in The First Omen, which was also released in the same year. All I can say is, good luck to whoever ends up playing Anna in the remake. For a modern viewer, the uncertainty as to whether we are watching performance, an actress pushed to the very edge of her sanity, or a combination of the two, adds much to the film's intensity, and also plays a significant role in the film's inclusion on lists celebrating extreme cinema. Because while the film might have its fair share of gore, the discomfort comes not from the murders and the bloodshed, but from the assault on the senses by so much raw emotion, whether it's Adjani's hysterical frustration or the barely suppressed primal rage bubbling within Sam Neill. Although Sam Neill's performance is not mentioned as often as Adjani's, he is her equal, and his experience on set was just as intense as his co-star, something that he described to writer Alison Taylor as being emotionally draining and physically exhausting. In his memoir, Did I Ever Tell You This?, which was published in 2022, he elaborated further, saying that while he admired Żuławski's artistic vision, much of his direction could have been more properly classified as bullying, saying, quote, Żuławski asked more of you than you could possibly give. There were times that he would scream or bellow at Adjani right in her face. It was distressing to see. You thought you yourself couldn't be crazier than you were, but you were mistaken. You needed to triple that. Nowadays, I doubt you'd get away with it. But with Żuławski, you would do whatever it was he wanted. And although that makes me sound like a classic victim of abuse, which in a sense I think we were, it was more than that. We had complete belief in him as an artist, and we wanted to make this thing, whatever it was. We really wanted to be in this thing. We were making something bigger than ourselves. End quote. One particularly challenging aspect came when he was called upon to strike Adjani as Mark and Anna argue in their apartment, a move that both the director and the actress insisted had to be done for real. Neill has described filming this moment as the first and last time he ever raised his hand to anyone, and it impacted him deeply, saying that after filming he found himself crying on the fire escape. Reflecting in his memoir, he said, quote, This was the thing about Żuławski. He could be a bully and arrogant, but he was a genius for all that. And it was all in the name, I guess, of achieving excellence. But now, while I always want to do my best for whatever director I'm working with, I doubt I would allow myself to be bullied into that again. End quote. Following this extremely violent argument with Anna, it transpires that she is hiding an aspect of her life from both her husband and her lover Heinrich, and so Mark hires a detective to follow her movements. And it is at this point that the film, which is already an intense experience to begin with, descends into body horror and insanity. It is revealed that Anna has created a monster, the result of the miscarriage in the underpass, a physical manifestation of thought made flesh. Compounding the issue, Anna has also murdered to protect her mutant offspring, killing the 2 detectives hired by her husband and almost doing away with her lover Heinrich when he too discovers her secret. First appearing as a half-seen blob of something or other, gradually, over the remainder of the film, the monster transforms into Mark's double, a version of him that Anna has quite literally birthed from her own unspoken frustration, confusion, and pain. This doppelganger acts as a pairing with Helen, and we can see him as Anna's idealized version of her husband, in much the same way that Helen is Mark's idealized version of his wife. But given his incredibly menacing behavior at the end of the film, It is also possible that this doppelganger signifies something far darker, more on which a little later. In any case, on making this discovery, Mark enters into what is essentially a folie à deux with his wife, going so far as to cover up her crimes and even commit murder on her behalf, possibly in an attempt to reassert control over the situation and, by extension, their relationship. Despite its horrific appearance, for co-writer Tuttin, Anna's ability to create the monster acts as a message of hope, saying that even in our loneliest moments, we can create something that nurtures our love. However, when writing it, he didn't think the monster would actually be shown and thought it would be suggested as a presence that would be merely glimpsed in the shadows. So you can imagine his surprise when he discovered that Żuławski intended to place the monster front and centre on the screen. Żuławski's first choice for creature design was H.R. Giger, the man behind the monster in 1979's Alien, with which he had been tremendously impressed. However, Giger was already busy on 2 more film projects, and so suggested Carlo Rambaldi, an Italian special effects guru who had moved to Hollywood and worked on Close Encounters of the Third Kind for Steven Spielberg, as well as many others. Rambaldi began work on the project from his studios in the US, and although sketches, models and design plans were circulated, it's fair to say that what he delivered on set was quite far removed from Żuławski's expectations. Quote, "He made a huge contraption, a huge guy, a pink guy, like 3 meters high, resembling a condom. We couldn't shoot with that." End quote. And he went on to tell the designer, "This is not a symbol, it's a penis. You just made the thing. It's just as if I filmed you without your underwear." And worse was to follow. Despite hailing originally from lower-budget Italian cinema, Rambaldi had become used to the luxury of time afforded by Hollywood, saying that he had been given weeks to set up the effects for Spielberg's Close Encounters. When Żuławski reminded him that their film was far lower budget and that the monster sequences were due to be shot the next day and in one day, he was rather taken aback. Possibly recapturing the inventiveness of his early career, Rambaldi and his 2 assistants worked through the night, using discarded film reels and tape to create the monster that we see in the movie. And while this is no doubt an improvement on his original design, I have to say it still leaves rather a lot to be desired. Particularly disconcerting are the green eyes that are given to it to signify its eventual transformation into Sam Neill, which initially appear like a pair of googly eyes stuck onto something and gives the beast an almost cartoonish look. On the other hand, though, perhaps there is something about the cheapness of the creature that works for the movie, with its weird appearance possibly far more suited to the rest of the film than a more polished beast that might have been more at home in Carpenter's The Thing. Possession began filming in Berlin in January 1980, using wide-angle lenses to capture a city which Neill described as being largely empty and strangely atmospheric. The division between the characters is shown through framing and composition and the contrasting colour palettes of blue and yellow, while tracking shots and handheld cameras are used to depict the conflict between and inside the 2 protagonists, like the whirling camera we see circling Mark as his world comes apart around him. There is also a repeated and very disquieting use of the 4th wall for Anna to directly address the viewer, even though it is apparent she is not addressing us, but whoever lies beyond. With this and the use of extreme close-ups, Possession is a horribly intimate film, placing the viewer in the role of uncomfortable voyeur and forcing them to bear witness to events that should preferably be kept behind closed doors if they need to happen at all. It is this intimacy that led to Adjani describing the film as psychological pornography and also accused the director of using his camera to look inside her very soul. As Kier-La Janisse observes in her book The House of Psychotic Women, quote, "The movie takes place in a strange hybrid of private and public reality that, in a sense, seems fitting for a couple undergoing a major transformation such as a breakup. Everything is exaggerated, everything is obscene, every action is hostile and tactless. In real life, any couple will only let you see what they want you to see. But for Mark and Anna, their breakup becomes an apocalyptic spectacle. End quote. Although we learn very little of Anna's background in the final version of the film, the original screenplay was to feature a character that would have revealed rather more. This character, Abe, was intended to be Anna's first husband, an elderly Jewish writer whose existence would have revealed far more about the character and her life before Mark. However, even though the role was cast, Żuławski decided during filming to cut the character from the screenplay. Żuławski has said this was to give the screenplay and the story a much less cluttered feeling, but there has been speculation that it might also have been prompted by the fact the actor cast in the role was repeatedly drunk and didn't represent Żuławski's vision for the character, even when sober. In the original screenplay, the character of Abe acted almost as a mystical guide for Mark, and was also used to foreshadow the film's apocalyptic ending, with dialogue discussing that the breakdown of relationships acts as a harbinger of doom. Quote, "There are no wives anymore, no pairs, no couples. There is a pattern, a mean god, a black star, a black hole moving close in the sky and sucking us in. This city, this whole world doomed." End quote. While certainly rather opaque, without this preceding dialogue, to say that the apocalyptic ending comes as something of a surprise is something of an understatement. Even if we choose the most straightforward reading and view the film simply as an analogy for human relations, the apocalyptic climax still resists any single interpretation. At its bleakest, it suggests the futility of all relationships, echoing the line originally given to Abe in the screenplay. But it can just as easily be read as a metaphor for the devastation of a breakup, that moment when your entire world collapses and you're forced to rebuild yourself from absolutely nothing. Either way, with Anna and Mark dead following a bizarre murder-suicide and replaced by soulless doubles, the film presents a deeply pessimistic view of human connection. However, there is also a deeper and more political interpretation, one which is reliant on how you choose to read the nature of the doppelgangers, and whether they are simply idealized versions of Mark and Anna, or whether they represent something else. Mark 2.0 is a decidedly menacing figure, seemingly cold and emotionless, while Helen, who is similarly controlled and logical, has come from the East and has had much to say about the nature of evil. In multiple interviews, Żuławski has said that the subway scene concerns the birth of malignant ideas and of evil thoughts being spoken into the world and made real. This then suggests that Mark 2.0 is a manifestation of evil in the world, the physical embodiment of a malignant idea. And given that both Mark 2.0 and Helen share the same piercing eyes, or at least were supposed to, if this is true of him, then we can also assume the same is true of Helen. Given the setting of the film and Żuławski's history, in this case we can assume that the evil is communism, and that the ending is an allusion to the escalation of the Cold War, with the doppelgangers representing a new world order of uniformity, empty of emotion, and of the very thing that makes us human, all of which, of course, heralds the end of the world. Then again, it could just be about relationships. Frustratingly, but not surprisingly, Żuławski refuses to provide any definitive answers. But for him, the ending was an instinctive choice, and an extension of the biblical and apocalyptic themes that he explored in his first two features. Quote, "I was born from an apocalypse. I was born in a city in Poland in 1940, and my sister died from hunger, and my mother and my father were the only surviving people from a huge family. So for me, everything commences and begins with an apocalypse." End quote. Despite the awards and the positive response at Cannes, as discussed earlier, Possession did not fare well on general release. The US cut, which is completely reordered and truncated, was panned by the critics, and its UK theatrical release was met with equal contempt. Worse was to come, though, with its release on UK home video when, as mentioned at the opening of the episode, it came under fire, following its inclusion on the notorious video nasties list. Shortly after this, the distributors were raided by the police, and 687 copies of Possession were confiscated. On September the 10th, 1984, the distributors, VTC, would be tried in court in London under the Obscene Publications Act. The scene that caused the most debate was perhaps, and not surprisingly, the sex scene featuring Anna and her monstrous partner. The prosecution rather ludicrously presented the argument that repeated viewing of the sequence might desensitize viewers into thinking that such relations were acceptable, and that they then might try to copy them at home, a case that the defence quite rightly pointed out was completely ridiculous. Isabelle Adjani and Sam Neill wrote statements in defence of the film, and after some deliberation, the jury found that Possession was not obscene by a vote of 11-1, a finding that was reported by the Daily Mail under the headline, quote, "Octopus sex film gets the OK." End quote. As well as her award at Cannes, Isabelle Adjani also won Best Actress at the 1982 César Awards and at the Fantasporto Awards in 1983. Also in 1983, she won her second César for her performance in the film One Deadly Summer, in which she plays a vengeful and possibly disturbed young woman who worms her way into the lives of a French rural family. This was the first movie that I ever saw her in, and I've been a fan ever since, so if you get the chance to see it, then I highly recommend it. Other films that I would suggest tracking down are the previously mentioned The Driver and The Story of Adele H, and Camille Claudel, for which she was again nominated for an Oscar. There is also Subway, directed by Luc Besson, in which she stars opposite Christophe Lambert, and my particular favourite, La Reine Margot, a period drama detailing the massacre of St. Bartholomew of 1572, in which thousands of Protestants were slaughtered when they travelled to Paris to attend a royal wedding. It's a fantastic film and definitely one to track down if you've never seen it, not least for Adjani's performance, for which she won another César for Best Actress. Now the holder of 5 César Awards, Isabelle Adjani has starred in over 70 films and TV shows, but for those who have seen it, Possession may be her defining performance. Asked to reflect on the experience in 2023, she acknowledged that it had been a difficult film to make and that she had also suffered personally because of it. But she also remained somewhat philosophical, saying, quote, "Looking back now, I find myself saying that our demons can sometimes become benevolent. When I think back to the nevertheless dangerous shooting of Possession for the young woman that I was, I remember that I wasn't afraid of what frightens me. I surrendered myself every day to the good and the bad wishes of the director. Because of this devastating shoot, my marriage fell apart, my life was in turmoil, and yet, thanks to this film, I won an acting prize at Cannes, a César, and so many other awards worldwide." In his films, Żuławski wanted to show, we are always being looked at. End quote. Andrzej Żuławski continued his directing career largely in France, following Possession with The Public Woman, released in 1984, and which seems to be just as divisive as his previous movie, at least if the reviews on IMDb are to be believed. In 1988, he would supervise the partial reconstruction of his cancelled sci-fi epic On the Silver Globe, which would eventually premiere at Cannes in the same year. In total, he directed 13 feature films across a 45-year period, reflecting the selective nature of his filmmaking process, as well as some of the struggles that were required to make them. His final film, Cosmos, was released in 2015, and he died a year later from cancer on the 17th of February 2016. He was 75 years old. All of which brings us on to the second of this week's movies, and a dramatic change in tone, if not necessarily a reduction in energy and frenetic camera work. This is La Bruja de Zugarramurdi, or The Witches of Zugarramurdi, from director Alex de la Iglesia. This film stars Hugo Silva, Mario Casas and Carmen Maura, and was released in 2013. As I mentioned, it was given the English language title Witching and Bitching, and much as I loathe it, I've decided that this is the title I'll use for the rest of the episode, if only because it's shorter and a lot easier to say. Witching and Bitching is Alex de la Iglesia's 14th feature, and for some, its release was seen very much as a return to his directorial roots. It was released following a period in which he had moved away from the anarchic genre cinema with which he made his reputation, and which had also helped to reboot Spanish genre filmmaking. It's fair to say that his output across this period was somewhat mixed. On the one hand, there was 2008's The Oxford Murders and 2011's As Luck Would Have It, neither of which were particularly well received by either critics or fans. On the other, though, we have the black comedy Commonwealth, which was nominated for multiple Goyas on its release in 2000, and also 2003's comedy western 800 Bullets, and 2010's The Last Circus, for which he won Best Director and Best Screenplay at the 67th Venice International Film Festival. During this time, he also established his production company, Poughkeepsie Films, with his wife, the producer and actress Carolina Bang. He also directed films for television and became the president of the Spanish Film Academy, all of which hardly make up the resume of somebody retreating from their creative roots. Nevertheless, the release of his first true genre feature in over a decade, delivered with no small amount of anarchy and chaos, caused many a genre fan to declare that Alex de la Iglesia was back. When asked about this reaction at the film's premiere, he expressed rather mixed feelings, saying that while he appreciated that the overall message was positive, the implication that he should be restricted to the tone and style of his earlier works was somewhat frustrating. Quote, "I love that people say that because the message is positive. My God, the one we loved and for a while we hated is back. Obviously, it also has its downside because it means that for a moment I was gone. But no, I'm still the same. It's just that this film is more like my earlier ones, perhaps because of the content, the occult elements, or perhaps it's more unhinged than others. I love that they say that the film is pure Alex, as I've also read, but on second reading, it really pisses me off. I've always been here. It just seems like you only like me if I make a truly crazy film." End quote. And whether marking a so-called return to form or not, Witching and Bitching is indeed a truly crazy film, stylistically, tonally, and thematically. A chaotic road movie that begins with a botched robbery and ends at a witch's sabbath, Iglesias' film is a battle of the sexes within a supernatural setting, filmed with broad comedy and characterization that have led some to accuse the director of misogyny. This is a claim that he quite naturally refutes, saying that the grotesque characters he employs target both genders equally, and concluding that his film is more misanthropic than it is anything else. While inspired partly by the director's own divorce, the inspiration for the story came from Iglesias' childhood in the Basque country, a region in which he says witches and sorcerers are very present. Inspired by the stories that his father told him as a child, while at university he decided to explore the topic further, reading up on the Spanish Inquisition and the legends of Zugarramurdi, a town situated around 200 kilometers from his birthplace. Zugarramurdi, in northern Spain, is a small, picturesque town known for its dramatic limestone caves, which are featured in the film's climax, and its association with witchcraft, most notably the witch trials led by the Spanish Inquisition in the 1600s. It is likely that people in this region originally worshipped a female deity, the goddess Mari, who personified Mother Earth and presided over a truly naturalistic religion, rooted in Basque matriarchism, with the woman of the house seen as the linchpin of both the farmhouse and society. It's been suggested that some of the rites held in her name might have drawn unwanted attention, and there were soon reports of witches' sabbats and of a black he-goat that could turn into a human when the witches gathered. Naturally enough, on hearing such reports, the Inquisition moved in, beginning the witch trials in 1609. Although the number of people executed was small in comparison to other persecutions in Europe, the Basque witch trials are considered to be the single biggest event of their kind. Some 7,000 cases were examined by the Inquisition, and of these, only 6 people were actually executed, condemned because they had refused to confess, express regret, or ask for mercy. The reason that the death rate was so low is significant, as the trials prompted no small amount of scepticism among the judges and also the Inquisitor General in Madrid. Unlike other parts of Europe, and I'm looking at you, Suffolk in England, Spain was comparatively cynical about witchcraft, believing it to be an outdated superstition based on self-delusion and lies. In the middle of the trials, the youngest of the judges, a man called Salazar, declared that he had found no proof at all of witchcraft during his interrogations, and also questioned the basis on which the trials had been called, saying, quote, "The real question is, are we to believe that witchcraft occurred in a given situation simply because of what the witches claim? No. It is clear that witches are not to be believed, and that judges should not pass a sentence on anyone unless the case can be proven with external and objective evidence, sufficient to convince everyone who hears it. And who can accept the following? That a woman can frequently fly through the air and travel 100 leagues in an hour? That a woman can get through a space not big enough for a fly? That a person can make himself invisible? That he can be in a river or the open sea and not get wet? Or that he can be in bed or at the Sabbath at the same time? And that a witch can turn herself into any shape she fancies, be it housefly or raven? Indeed, these claims go beyond all human reason, and may even pass the limits permitted by the devil himself." End quote. So, nice to hear a bit of common sense there, though, as if to prove there's nothing quite like a bitter work colleague, the other two judges involved in the trials then decided to accuse Salazar himself of being in league with the devil. Fortunately, this was not before the matter was referred to the Inquisitor General in Madrid, who appeared to share Salazar's opinion. As a result, new and more rigorous rules of evidence were introduced, and these effectively brought the practice of witch burning in Spain to an end, long before it declined in other parts of Europe. The research that Iglesia undertook at university stayed with him, and in fact he originally intended to include a reference to the witches in 1998's The Day of the Beast, although this idea was eventually abandoned. But the topic of witchcraft remained one that he wanted to explore, although, as he freely admits, he wanted to tell the story from a decontextualized viewpoint. And now we are getting into the spoiler section of the episode, so, as always, if you haven't seen the movie, it might be advisable for you to press pause and return once you have. If Iglesias fans had been impatiently awaiting a return to his earlier cinema of excess, it's safe to say that the opening moments of witching and bitching well and truly deliver. Following a pre-credit sequence introducing his very modern interpretation of Basque witches, the credits are presented over images of witches through history. These include works by Francisco Goya and Luis Ricardo Falero, and amusingly, portraits of Mary Tudor, Betty Davis, Greta Garbo, and Margaret Thatcher. While I'm pretty certain that at least one of these was probably an agent of darkness, according to Iglesia, their inclusion here is a declaration of his intent, depicting women who inspire respect, fascination, and fear. That being said, though, for fans of cinematic errors, the credits do contain an absolute doozy, and this is the accidental inclusion of a photo of women in Welsh traditional costume, an image that is often mistaken for a portrait of witches. It's a mistake that raises a smile every time I watch the movie, and I like to imagine that right now Mrs. Thatcher is probably looking up at us and smiling about that one too. Following this, and a theme-setting warning about the Whore of Babylon, the film proper opens with a botched robbery of a pawn shop carried out by two of our nominal heroes, Jose and Tony, in a sequence that is more over the top and irreverent than anything Iglesia had previously filmed. Filmed in Puerta del Sol, one of the busiest public spaces in Madrid, its multiple camera angles, crowd coordination and stunt work immediately signal a step up in ambition, and you only have to compare this sequence to a similar scene in The Day of the Beast to see how far De la Iglesia had travelled in terms of scale and, of course, budget. It's also incredibly funny, including a brief visual gag involving an invisible man that makes me laugh out loud every time. Given that the robbers have disguised themselves as living statues and mascots, including a toy army soldier, a gold-painted Jesus, and SpongeBob SquarePants, the plan seems doomed to failure from the outset, something that becomes even more apparent when we realise that Jose has brought his young son Sergio along for the ride, and in fact has employed him as a lookout. During this scene, it emerges that Jose's involvement is motivated by his recent divorce and custody battles with his ex-wife, and that his master plan is to abduct Sergio, rob the pawn shop, and then flee to France, where he hopes to start a new life without interference from his ex. Not the smartest plan in the world, it must be said, but then again, as soon becomes apparent, Jose is not the smartest person in the world either. It's hardly a shock then when the robbery goes badly wrong. First, when Jose's complaints about his divorce trigger a domestic dispute among the hostages, and secondly, when SpongeBob SquarePants starts gunning people down indiscriminately. And that's not a phrase you hear every day of the week. Fleeing the scene, Jose, Sergio and Tony are forced to hijack a taxi when Tony's girlfriend drives off in their getaway car. And after a demolition derby police chase, they force the driver, Manuel, to head north towards France. As many said at the time, Alex de la Iglesia was well and truly back. Much like his historic inspirations, the seed of this sequence had been with the director for a long time, dating back to a film he had planned to make before the Day of the Beast. This was an abandoned project called I Want to Have a Million Friends, which would have opened during a Holy Week pilgrimage, in which Jesus was both a bank robber and toting a machine gun. And even though that project never came to fruition, the image was so strong that, much like the Story of the Witches, the thought stayed with him and then would be incorporated into this film. Filmed in an incredibly frenetic style, this sequence not only delivers an immersive and breathtaking opening to the film, it also establishes the central theme of male anxiety, emphasized through dialogue in which the three unlikely protagonists complain about their lot in life and place the blame squarely at the foot of womankind. Jose struggles with maintenance payments, judges, and his quote-unquote witch of an ex-wife, while Tony reveals he has taken part in the robbery because he is afraid to tell his girlfriend that he has lost his job. Manuel, the hostage cab driver, joins in with the conversation, saying that women have ruined his life and that his mother, sister, and wife frequently meet for coffee just to criticize him. And even young Sergio has complaints about the girls that he goes to school with. Given these exchanges, it is perhaps not surprising that some have interpreted the film as misogynistic, an argument that would probably hold more weight were it not blatantly obvious that all of the men are, being blunt, complete idiots. Jose is quite possibly the most irresponsible father in Spanish cinema, the security guard in the Madrid pawn shop is a sexist moron, and Tony, as well as complaining about his partner and his sexual inadequacies, also finds a moment to express his confusion at all of the buttons on his kitchen stove. Much like Possession, the narrative was very much inspired by the director's own divorce from his first wife, which was finalized in 2010, and it therefore reflects his perception of sexual dynamics of the time, saying, quote, "Each of the characters gets involved in the world of women in a more or less pathetic way, and that's something I find very funny, not with any malice, and certainly not with any intention of passing judgment. But yes, men are somewhat foolish beings who live in a world of confusion. My own life is quite comical in that respect. The life of a divorced person is inherently comical, and it's also tragic. There are times when you wonder why you can't be with your daughters more, and that puts you in a dramatic situation, but at the same time, it also keeps you alive." End quote. Following the robbery and the escape, our protagonists are pursued by Jose's ex-wife, Sylvia, and two police investigators who are tracking Sylvia as a way to find Jose. En route, the group stop at the village of Zugarramurdi, where they encounter the witches of the title, who believe that Sergio is the chosen one needed for their climactic ritual. And it is from this point onwards that the film seems to draw most criticism, namely in its portrayal of the female characters as being quite literal manipulative witches. Even Jose's ex, Sylvia, initially presented as a nurse and a caring mother, ends up becoming part of the coven, with her appearance becoming more haggard and monstrous as she does. The witches, with their metal teeth, wild hair, and deathly appearance, are of course grotesques, and harken back to the Spanish literary tradition of esperpento that we discussed in episode 1. Climbing around the walls and ceiling in an incredibly impressive sequence, they are a combination of grim fairy tale and the works of Francisco Goya, a fervent painter of witches, most famously in his painting The Witches' Sabbath. But while Goya's witches dance around a traditional figure of the black-horned male goat, in Della Iglesia's vision, the object of the worship is a mother goddess who appears, all 15 feet of her, in the climactic scene of the movie. She is based on a Paleolithic fertility figure called the Venus of Willendorf, which is estimated to be 30,000 years old. A 4-inch figurine carved from limestone that was found in Austria in 1908, little to nothing is known of its origin, but its exaggerated female features have led many to consider it a form of fertility totem. Its attributes are clearly reflected in the figure of the mother goddess who appears at the film's climax, where we learn that the witches plan to make her dominant once more and return the world to its natural order, the very thing we were warned about immediately after the credits. This plot twist explains the other reason that he chose Zugarramurdi as the film's setting, and this is its history of folk magic and matriarchal spirituality. Again, this dates back to his time at university, where he says that a professor, quote, helped me to understand the relationship between early Basque matriarchy and European or Christian patriarchy. There's an underlying naturalist religion that doesn't come from a hybrid European world, but from a previous world where woman is the queen of nature. She is the mother goddess in relation to the great father god, and the rupture between the two generates malaise like the one that we're experiencing now. With a total shift to a father god, everything dies. End quote. Given this, I would suggest that with the men depicted as idiots and the women as witches, Iglesia is highlighting that neither side in this battle is particularly appealing. Ultimately, I think he seems to be saying that whether aligned with the patriarchy or the matriarchy, what we should be striving for is balance, a point that becomes clearer when the film is viewed not as an endorsement of either side, but as a deliberately exaggerated critique of both. Ultimately, though, the film is a comedy, one described by the director as, quote, for women to laugh at the men, and in which the women are the queens of the film, end quote, going on to say that he simply tried to have a vision of the conflict between the sexes, and that he put himself on the weaker side. And the film is incredibly funny, drawing its humour from the ludicrous nature of the situations, the incredibly straight-faced performances, and countless visual gags. Look out for the cameo from Patrick the Starfish. Admittedly, some of the humour is rather twisted, and some of the jokes land better than others, but they are delivered with such frequency that any occasional lapse in quality is quickly forgotten. It also looks fantastic, with a saturated colour palette of yellows and blues, and a visual style that references Iglesia's previous life as a comic book artist. Filmed on a reported budget of €6 million, the scale and complexity of the shoot were challenging, as well as wrangling a very large cast and trying to film the opening sequence in central Madrid. There was also the final ritual in the caves. Iglesia has said that this was the hardest thing he had ever filmed up to that point, and that it took a year and a half to complete due to the editing and all of the special effects, which were at the time among the most ambitious in Spanish cinema. Witching and Bitching received its international premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival during the coveted Midnight Madness programme, a slot that seems particularly fitting given the chaotic and genre-bending energy of the movie. Later in the same month, it was released theatrically in Spain, where, despite some of the previously mentioned criticisms, it was a financial success, earning €1.3 million on its opening weekend and becoming the fourth highest grossing Spanish-produced film of the year. It was also a major success at the 28th Goya Awards, winning 8 awards from the 10 categories in which it was nominated, including Best Supporting Actress, Best Art Direction, Best Special Effects, and Best Costume Design. At one stage, Iglesia mooted a possible sequel, picking up the open ending and potentially causing more outrage, though this has yet to emerge. As to the sexual politics of the movie, I will leave the final words to the director himself, who emphasises that while his film may be set across gendered battle lines, his work is actually more of a comment on human relations altogether, saying, quote, "I think it's impossible to have a normal relationship with people because we all pretend to be friends, while envy and jealousy always prevail. In reality, the dominant feelings are envy and jealousy and the lust for money and power. Education prevents us from killing each other, but at least in movies, we can tell each other the truth. In my opinion, there's nothing innovative in cinema. Everything you see comes from the filmmaker's personal experiences and what he has seen, heard, and experienced in his life. I think we directors are like bartenders, like cocktail makers who, depending on our skill, turn out more or less well. The secret is to start with two opposing ideas, set them in conflict, and then let the force of attraction be the only tension capable of keeping them in balance." End quote. Possession and Witching and Bitching are both films born from the personal experiences of their respective directors, each using the fallout of a failed relationship as the spark for their story. One is an opaque and harrowing portrait of emotional and physical breakdown laced with political subtext, and the other is a broad and unruly comedy that leans into sexual stereotypes to explore the widening gulf between men and women. Probably not the films you'd want to watch while going through a breakup, or possibly exactly the films to watch when going through one. Tonally, they are as different as it is possible for films to be. But together, they offer two strangely complementary visions, proving that when relationships fall apart, the results might be terrifying, but they can also be completely absurd. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, you can always email the horrordouble@gmail.com and follow the Instagram account @thehorrordouble. Next week, we are back to haunted houses, with one film that is widely acknowledged as a classic, and another which, in my opinion, just doesn't get the love that it deserves. First up, we have The Innocents from 1961, directed by Jack Clayton. This is based on the novella The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and stars Deborah Kerr, Michael Redgrave, Megs Jenkins, Martin Stevens, and Pamela Franklin. Then we jump forward to 1977 and a film based on a novel by Peter Straub. This is Full Circle, which was released in the US as The Haunting of Julia. This is directed by Richard Loncraine and stars Mia Farrow, Kier-La, Tom Conti, and Jill Bennett. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they may be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you once again very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.